Welcome to Penn State Dickinson Law's Profiles in Leadership series. My name is Darrell Lim. I serve as the H. Leddy Montague Junior Chair and Associate Dean for Research and Innovation at the Law School. This series offers an unparalleled opportunity to glean insights from top leaders in the field who serve in government, industry, the private sector, civil society, and academia. In each episode, we invite these leaders to reflect on their journeys and share skills, core values, and qualities that make them the leaders they are today. We're very pleased to have Professor Bill Kovacic, Global Competition Professor of Law and Policy, Professor of Law, and Director of the Competition Law Center at the George Washington University Law School. He was a member of the Federal Trade Commission and chaired the agency. He was also the FTC's General Counsel. He received the FTC's Miles W. Kirkpatrick Award for Lifetime Achievement. He served as a non-executive director with the United Kingdom's Competition and Market Authority and vice chair for outreach for the International Competition Network. He has advised many countries and international organizations on antitrust, consumer protection, government contracts, and the design of regulatory institutions. At GW, Professor Kovacic has taught antitrust, contracts, and government contracts. He is co-editor of the Journal of Antitrust Enforcement. He graduated with a bachelor's degree from Princeton University and received his JD from Columbia Law School, where he was a Harlan Stone Scholar. Welcome.
Thank you, Darrell. It's delightful for me to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Tell us about the Competition Law Center. What are three things that folks should know about it?
The center was founded just about 15 years ago by reason of a very generous C. Prey Award that was authorized by the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia. It gave us a healthy endowment, and the income really is focused on policy implementation issues. Our interest in building the center was to not so much focus on the substance of what competition policy should be, not so much on the questions of what agencies should do, but how agencies should do them, the methodology for enforcement, the techniques for policy implementation. Our sense in creating the center was that we devote a disproportionate amount of time to discussions about matters of theory and concept, very important in discussing the basis on which competition agencies intervene, what competition law should do, but that too little attention was given to the question of policy implementation, to close the distance between what Graham Allison, the political scientist at the Kennedy School, once called the distance between the policy aspiration and its realization in practice. And the center is really dedicated to finding out how to cross that distance and do it successfully.
How old is the center today?
Yeah, we were set up in 2007, 2008. That we really became operational in 2008, and we've had a number of programs that are designed to realize this vision. We've created a data set of the world's competition authorities, benchmarking them according to 10 basic institutional characteristics. We found that there's a painful lack of readily available information on how agencies are structured, what they do, to facilitate comparisons at any one moment that an agency might take to say, well, how many agencies have a competition and consumer function? How many agencies are multifunction? There it was always interesting to find out that of all the world's competition agencies, more than half of them have a mandate that goes beyond competition law. Consumer protection is the most common, but in a sense, it's a bit misleading to simply call them competition authorities. They are competition plus authorities. To have that snapshot available at any one time, but then to talk about the migration of functions over time to see trends in how agencies evolve. That's one example of a long-running project that we've been focused on.
Do you work with other law schools, other institutions?
We do. One of the most important sets of relationships that we've formed are in the Western Hemisphere. We have close relationships with a number of academic hubs in Latin America. Our objective there was to develop that community as a specific focus for attention. There are a couple of wonderful university centers across the continent, in Santiago, in Lima, in Buenos Aires, in Colombia, in Bogota, and in Mexico City. Our aim was to create a collaboration across universities to both be a resource to the competition authorities, to help provide insights about how policy is developing, but also to improve their ability to deliver good educational programs to their own students. We had a meeting at the end of the American Bar Association's Antitrust Law Section program, the annual spring meeting in Washington in April. And this is the third year we've done it. We've invited officials from the Latin American authorities and practitioners and academics. We started with 30 the first year. We had 140 on the Friday of the ABA event. And I think we're seeing a number of areas in which a collaboration between academia and the competition implementation system can be very useful. And we're seeing that in many ways there's a real hunger to try to build a good synapse across those agencies. So it's the best example of what we've been doing.
Thanks. Let's switch gears to current events, and probably the hottest thing that's come out in the news recently is the news on non-competes. Talk about the conception and execution of non-competes from the FTC, the rule against non-competes, and give a score, if you like, on how it's been done.
I think the interest in the subject is long overdue, and it's a good topic. I think it's been a good topic for a considerable period of time. Certainly, a literature that's grown up over 20, 25 years about the extraordinary breadth of non-competes and their wide use in areas where you might not imagine that there would be a compelling reason to impose them. In the earlier literature, certainly going back to my time as a student in the 1970s, the focus on non-competes was on individuals who had special insight into the operation of a business. A chief financial officer, for example, a chief technologist, senior executives, heads of marketing, who knew the customer base, who knew the firm's current plans and future intentions. Those were the ordinary categories of individual who was bound by a non-compete. We see in the modern era that they're used far more broadly to people who would seem not to have any connection with those kinds of special skills or insights into the business. So it's a very good topic, and they certainly can restrict the mobility of workers in important ways. The FTC's approach, I think, is perhaps questionable on two grounds. One is the FTC, for the most part, across a wide range of non-competes, is imposing a categorical ban. That is, they're taking what the common law and most state statutes regarded as a rule of reason inquiry and converting it into a per se prohibition with no room for justifications. There's some carved out categories of individuals, but not very broad ones. And in setting out the case for the categorical prohibition, I would say the FTC did not come to grips in a truly convincing way with the literature that said this is a good area to examine. There are categories of workers who ought not to be covered by these types of agreements, that suggested that the appropriate methodology might go back to early English decisions that established what might have been called a rebuttable presumption against non-competes. That is, it was a presumption that they were not enforceable. The burden of defense rested on the shoulders of the business enterprise. That some variant of that might have been appropriate, but instead the FTC largely brushed aside that literature and went directly to a categorical prohibition. So one wonders how rigorously and actively the FTC dealt with that body of thinking about where you might prohibit and where not. The other is that the Commission's authority to issue rules involving competition policy is uncertain. I would say the FTC has a plausible basis for asserting its authority. I think that plausible basis is also fragile. It rests on a single federal Court of Appeals decision that's 50 years old now, a Court of Appeals decision that was not validated by the Supreme Court, not embraced by other circuits. There's an argument that some of it was absorbed into subsequent legislation, but that involves a degree of reasoning by inference and indirection. These are techniques of interpretation that I think our Supreme Court of late has not been fond of. And the Commission has somewhat fresh experience with this in the AMG Capital case, which challenged the FTC's asserted authority to use Section 13B of the FTC Act to obtain equitable monetary remedies. The Supreme Court rejected that. The Commission had gained acceptance in the lower courts, broad acceptance, from the late 70s up through the recent past. The Supreme Court took note of this experience and said, but they don't speak for us. And where you mean to do powerful things, we want a relatively clear statement of your authority to do that in the statute itself. Congress knows how to use the right terms. They didn't do it here. And in this case, the Commission's purporting to do something very powerful. And I'm doubting that the court will accept a more elaborate and nuanced and in many ways inferential analysis to get to the goal. The last barrier is the so-called major questions doctrine, where the Supreme Court has said, if you have rulemaking authority, but you want to do especially bold things with it, you have to show us that the grant of rulemaking authority anticipated that the agency would do those kinds of bold things. We'll not infer an especially broad grant of authority to do earth-shaking things unless the statute says that. Statute has to point that out. The Commission's press release in announcing the proposed and now final rule could not have done more to scream out, this is a major question. It points to the fact that the Commission is displacing the state laws of over 45 states. That is, that in most states, the common law or statutory approach is a rule of reason approach. The FTC is displacing that completely with a per se prohibition. The FTC points out how many wages are at stake every year. It points out what it believes to be the broad economic impact, as well as the impact on specific sectors such as healthcare. Line after line says, this is a big deal. That really invites a reviewing court at some point to say, if it is such a big deal, we need a clear grant of authority to engage in that kind of fundamental policymaking. So there's a plausible basis to support the rule. It's a good topic, but I think the FTC internally must have told itself, perhaps it is not the end of the world if we lose this matter. Maybe their view is that the objective of this was to raise consciousness, to draw attention to the issue, and that they're willing to suffer the defeat of the measure in light of these kinds of hurdles.
So it sounds like it was a tactical move, not so much to actually enforce non-competes in perpetuity, but rather as a strategic move. How much of that strategic move do you think it is political in nature in attempting to win votes for the party that placed the commissioners who voted in favor of the
President
rule?
of the United States in July of 2021 issued an executive order on competition policy. This is the executive order that called for a whole of government approach to implementing competition policy, not just within the narrow ambit of an antitrust enforcement program at the Federal Trade Commission or Department of Justice, but that all government agencies should consider their capacity to improve competitive conditions by the use of their existing authority. The president laid out an extensive list, I think 70 plus specific items that he desired different government agencies to take up. He suggested in that list that the FTC use its rulemaking authority to issue a rule on non-competes. The president, when he talks about, says, of course, the FTC is an independent agency. I just suggested it. The FTC will say, we are an independent agency. These are suggestions. I doubt that this item got on the list without the FTC's suggestion that it be on the list. And I think that this is the form of a suggestion that is better interpreted as a command, which the FTC is quite willing to carry out.
Well, let me ask you about this then. We talk about the independence of agencies, but you have got a porous wall really between Congress and the FTC, and we've seen that in the top leadership ranks and the transition between them. So, is that something that concerns you in terms of the FTC being able to function independently of political forces? And you can see with the non-competes, a clear vote along partisan lines.
There is a built-in tension in the design of the agency that goes back to the original statute in 1914. The 1914 statute encompasses a very flexible, scalable mandate. That's the ban on unfair methods of competition, with a specific direction to the FTC to use this authority to create what Dan Crane at the University of Michigan has called new norms of business behavior, to execute a norms creation function that carries competition policy beyond the boundaries of the Sherman Act, to create new principles of business behavior. That's a formidable element of decision-making authority. The other formidable power is the power to conduct studies without regard to the application in a specific competition law case, to go and conduct studies that illuminate business conditions, that explain commercial phenomena, and to do it using compulsory process. In effect, to go on fishing expeditions to learn more about the economy and how specific firms operate. Those are both considerable, formidable elements of power. If you create that kind of power, you inevitably ask, what's going to be the accountability mechanism? Well, there's accountability in front of the courts, but I think you're begging for demands for accountability within the electoral process itself. The Congress, during the floor debates on the FTC Act in the Senate, Albert Cummins, a senator from Iowa, progressive, who was asked, was a major sponsor of the FTC Act, was asked, unfair methods of competition, are there any boundaries on this? What keeps the FTC from simply going run amok? And he says, it is broad authority, but I remind you, the commission will exercise that under the eye of Congress. If the FTC were to abuse this authority, we, the Congress that created the agency, could destroy it. This was Cummins' way, in effect, of saying, with this remarkable mandate will come remarkable accountability mechanisms. So we will be right in the face of the FTC if we don't think they're doing what we wish them to. At the same time, there are all sorts of oversight or control tools built into the executive branch side of the equation. The 1950 Reorganization Act that gives the president the power to designate the chair of the FTC from among existing members of the FTC, that gives other acts, that give the White House the ability to control information demands, the Paperwork Reduction Act. The fact that the president submits the budget for the entire government, including the Federal Trade Commission. The FTC doesn't go to Congress directly with its budget, it goes through the White House. So there are pressure points that come from both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue, from the White House and from the Congress. The FTC physically is located a bit closer to Congress. I think that tells us something. It tells us that Congress is keenly regards the FTC as being an extension of itself. It's a bit further away from the White House, but nonetheless, still subject to White House influence. I always recall, reading congressional hearings and thinking about my own confirmation proceedings. A question that every FTC nominee to the board is asked is, you understand, don't you, that you are an arm of Congress? You are a creature of Congress. The correct answer for a nominee to that question is yes, Senator, with absolute clarity. The wrong answer would be to say, oh, no, Senator, the FTC is an independent agency. We're not an arm of Congress. We're independent. If you gave that answer, you'd be asked to leave the room and think about it for a while before you came back in. So the design of the entire mechanism anticipated that in return for broad, expansive power, there would be broad, expansive oversight. And you can ask at some level, is that a sustainable model? Will the agency have enough autonomy to make key decisions without dramatic intervention by elected officials? And I suppose the autonomy that has to be fought for at all costs is the autonomy to take decisions on who to investigate, whom to prosecute, and what sanctions to impose. The minute that it appears as though that guidance is coming from elected officials, courts will not respect or give deference to the agency's decisions. The agency stands before the courts and say, respect my decisions because we are the experts. They will not do it if they think you are simply the puppet of an elected official. And the second respect is that for purposes of larger legitimacy, if it seems as though this formidable power is being exercised simply at the behest of specific legislators, that the authorities withheld to favor friends or is used to punish enemies, the very legitimacy of the institution falters. So I think this inherent tension between broad scalable authority and accountability has beset the agency from its beginning. I am ultimately not sure if that is a sustainable model. That the Congress will respect. Yeah.
In that regard, if you have this mandate at the same time accountability and you have, in a sense, inbuilt politicization of FTC's policy goals, then I think the chair of the FTC has both the responsibility and the obligation to work across the aisle. It's by design a bipartisan institution, and yet we see time and time again votes simply along party lines. And you result in having non-competes that are per se illegal rather than along the rule of reason, a more centrist approach. So how would you or how did you, as chair and as commissioner, work with your colleagues across the aisle?
As a starting point, there's no question that given the mandatory political diversification on the board, there's an enormous benefit to generating decisions that are 5-0 or 4-1. That if key policy decisions are taken on a 3-2 vote repeatedly on what I would say anything that matters, over time that raises questions about the legitimacy of the institution. In the eyes of Congress, that political diversification was seen as being crucial as a discipline to ensure that decisions were carefully considered. So either you have to work hard with colleagues to generate the core area of consensus and build on that, and perhaps not obtain as broad a form of intervention as you might have wished acting alone, or you have to come up with a compelling explanation for why your position on a 3-2 vote ought to be decisive, and to demonstrate that we took the views of the minority very seriously and that you address them in a way that's convincing. You can either build a consensus. I mean, I found in my experience, I met with my colleagues, typically each of them once a week. And a key part of those meetings is, what do you want to do? What do you think we should be doing? To build a sense of common cause. Because when the agency joined arms and acted as a unity, that sent, I thought, a very positive signal to courts where we either were going to court in the first instance to obtain an injunction and a merger, or to reviewing courts that were looking at our work. That was very important. But that requires the chair to invest heavily in building those relationships, even when the opposition internally can be irritating. I confess I had days when I thought that the correct number, that a commission with 5 members was exactly 4 too many, that it would have been better to have a unitary executive run the agency. But the other is that if you do have a split it's incumbent upon you to provide the careful statement of what your opponents wish to do and to give your best explanation for why you disagree.
Thank you. Bill, it looks like you're frozen on my side. If you could turn the video off and on again, that might reset it.
Okay, is that better?
Still frozen.
Still frozen. Yep, let me try the camera a couple times. Back? They're still frozen.
Okay, there we go. Yeah, you're good
Okay.
now.
Okay.
Okay, let's move on to digital platforms. So the sense is that the goalpost is moving. You've got antitrust laws don't work. They put in new legislation. You've seen that in spades in Europe, and the US seems to be eager to follow our European counterparts. Is it an effective and good way of regulating gatekeepers, or should we recognize that ideology, like in the US, where you have companies that succeed, as they said, Scalia said, and Trenko should not be turned upon Alcoa, and you distribute wealth in other ways. What are your thoughts on the regulation of digital platforms?
I mean, I'm very influenced here by my experience with the Competition and Markets Authority in the UK, which did two things that I think are the right way to approach the subject. One is that they invested heavily in using the Market Studies Authority to examine specific sectors. Beginning in the middle of the previous decade, they started doing studies involving all things digital, different specific topics. This enabled them in an incremental way to build a lot of knowledge about the sector. That development of knowledge led to an important insight for them, which is that there can be benefits of having prescriptive rules, as there can be in a variety of areas of competition policy. But the prescriptive rules have to take careful account of the enterprises that you're regulating. And one of their strong conclusions is that it would be a mistake to adopt a uniform set of principles for all of the leading information services platforms. The approach taken by the Digital Markets Act in the European Union, for example, establishes a long list of conclusive prescriptive rules that apply across the board to all gatekeepers. The CMA concluded that was not a sound approach, that you had to take account of differences across the platforms. And that made, in my mind, that made a great deal of sense. An unfortunate consequence of Brexit is that if the United Kingdom had stayed in the room in Brussels discussing the future of platform regulation, it would not have come out the way that it did. I can't assert that as an absolute certainty. I wasn't in the room. I don't know what the European Parliament and the Council, what they ultimately would have done, but I'm keenly aware of the leavening influence that the United Kingdom had in those types of deliberations. And I think we would have seen a more discriminating approach in the selection of ex-ante regulatory tools. There would have been grounded more in the kind of research that the United Kingdom has carried out. The other element that I'll add to it is that the UK decided over 5 years ago that it had to build a special capability internally to do this kind of work. That if you were going to do big tech regulation, you could not simply rely upon the insights of lawyers and economists. And they developed a conscious program to hire information technologists, computer scientists, engineers, specialists in data analytics. The team now has over 60 individuals, and that team is used expansively to support work inside the agency to help guide their market studies and to put them in a position to understand exactly what they're looking at to formulate a more accurate hypothesis and to put it in place. So that combination of extensive study, which taught the CMA that it was best to have a more nuanced set of ex-ante regulatory interventions instead of a broad uniform prescription, and the development of a internal analytical capability to apply conventional antitrust tools or new regulatory tools, I think made a lot of sense. And again, I think we'd have seen some variation of that in European decision making if Brexit had
But what
not
about
taken.
Ireland? Ireland is a common law jurisdiction, isn't it? It's part of the EU.
The Irish Competition Authority is a very capable group. It's much smaller, and its base of experience on these kinds of issues is not as extensive as the CMA. And I'd say they were never quite in the position to build the base of accumulated knowledge that could be brought to bear on these issues in the same way that the UK did. So, a very capable institution, excellent analysts, but the CMA had more depth and scope, and so it would have had a more effective voice.
Let me ask you this, because you spend a lot of time in the UK and in Europe as well, and you probably noticed, as I have, that in the US there are a lot of big companies, and you can say what you want about big companies, but they bring with them clear economies of scale. Europe seems to have this fascination with small is beautiful, and so you have these little artisan shops. You hardly see any chain stores. Less in the UK than in the US, and even less on the continent than the UK. And we see almost in real time neo-Brandisian antitrust manifested in this idea that if you're big, we take you down and we share the wealth. Does it worry you if the US heads in the direction that Europe is heading?
My interpretation of what European economic analysts, public officials have had to say about the trends you described is that they would like to have larger, successful enterprises. And the question for them is, why don't we have more of them? What is it about our enabling business environment that keeps firms from growing in the same way? The UK had a celebration of the 10th anniversary of the CMA a couple of weeks ago, and they had a public program with a couple of panel discussions that featured, in one instance, specialists in the UK economy looking at economic trends. And there was a general lament about how the UK had relatively low levels of productivity, smaller number of new business startups, and growth of businesses over time. The concern there wasn't, goodness, we have too many big companies. The question is, why don't we have enough big companies? Why don't we have more large, successful enterprises? And I think this is the question that bedevils policymakers in Europe at the same time. It's where are our equivalents to these successful enterprises? Now, maybe they would have some idea about how successful they want them to be, or how large. Would they want them to be dominant on the scale that some of the famous US platforms are? But I think the puzzle that they face is we don't have many enterprises that are even close to that. And what is it about our economic system, our culture, that keeps that from happening?
Any answer?
I think there are several things that they point to. One is a different culture regarding business, new business creation and failure. In the US, there's no inhibition about creating an enterprise that will fail. And the sense is that quite often it will take a couple of failures to get it right. But that's not a stigma. In a number of continental countries in particular, it is a stigma. It's a sense of betraying your employees and letting the larger society down. So it's held out as an indication of not just economic failure, but some element of moral dereliction as well. I think another factor is the enabling environment that is a function of capital formation limits on new business development, mobility of labor that have an influence on the ability of firms to take root and grow in the member states and across the European Union. But maybe the most formidable is this attitude toward risk taking and a willingness to accept failure as an inevitable element in the journey to success.
Interesting. And do you think that weighs more heavily than the regulatory differences between the two jurisdictions?
When I've talked to entrepreneurs who've been famously successful, I can't say it's the most important factor. I'd say it's second to none. And I think that's a continuing topic of inquiry and self-assessment in Europe, which is why don't we see more success? We're spending so much time looking at major platforms from North America. Where are our platforms? The big platforms are coming from Asia, from China, and from North America. Where are our equivalents?
What I hear is if you're successful in Europe to a small degree, the first thing you do is you decamp to Silicon Valley, find a good venture capital firm, and grow here because once you get big, you're not going to be shot down in the same way that you are in Europe. China is homogeneous, and so they have economies of scale and they have lots of state money. That's a different equation altogether, but you've got neither for those conditions of growth.
I think we're seeing a fascinating debate and shift in policy about the role of the state in Europe too. You can make an argument that the investment of the government in enterprise in China, the investment of the government in semiconductors, green technologies in the United States are putting pressure on the European Union to walk away from many of its current competition law-driven attitudes towards state aid. To read the comments of senior officials in the European Commission, there's an increasing sense of we can't stand on the sidelines and allow this to happen. Now, it doesn't necessarily show that the investments being made in China or the United States are being made wisely. I guess a question all of us could ask just in North America is, we're spending a lot of money. How well are we spending it? But there's a great anxiety, I think, in Europe that they're missing a good game, and that without loosening controls on state aid, they will see the migration of industry in both directions, east and west, and key players will move to North America, will move to invest more heavily in China because that's where they're getting vital financial support to grow. So I think there's a considerable amount of pressure building up, already exists within the European Union, to decide what the role of the state as a venture capitalist, as a financier ought to be. And you're seeing, I think, clear evidence that we're not going to just watch China and the US hand out generous subsidies, especially if it means that our firms walk away.
Of course, it's a chicken and egg issue because state aid requires funding. And if you're going to cause your best companies to decamp to both places, you're not going to have that source of funding.
You have to pay for all this.
Exactly.
And I guess they've approached it in a couple of ways. I mean, they're creating regulatory frameworks that focus on how companies in other countries are getting their money. That's the foreign subsidy review mechanism that asks, are you getting a competitive advantage in Europe because you're being supported by foreign governments? But at the same time saying, we can't stand back and fail to provide encouragement and support to our own countries. Now, it's a debate that's happening over semiconductors, everything green energy, military and defense suppliers across the board.
So this is the series is called Profiles in Leadership, so I don't want to talk about you. Let's switch gears and talk about that. Three things for a start that people should know about you.
I spent, a fair part of my entire career in the federal government in its different branches. I spent a year as a law clerk. I spent a total of over 15 years in the civil service, and then as an outside director on the CMA. So that's given me an opportunity to see firsthand how specific institutions operate. The second thing is that I got to spend 1 year as a research assistant for the committee that developed the Hart-Scott-Rodino legislation. I worked for Philip Hart's Antitrust and Monopoly Subcommittee from the summer of 1975 through the summer of 1976. I was a very humble research assistant. I'd finished 1 year of law school. I had a leave of absence to take this job, but I got to see the legislative process firsthand and to watch the formulation of a legislative measure that's had a big impact in our field. I guess the third is that I've had the great fortune of spending, as you mentioned earlier, a lot of time working in a variety of countries that are developing new competition systems. I suppose I've worked in some depth in about 60 countries now, so I've had the chance not to spend years inside the House, but to spend a significant amount of time over time watching these institutions develop and to get some sense of what it takes to build a truly sustainable program.
Thanks. So three follow-up questions to each of those. Why, first of all, why not private practice? If you look at your arc of your career, it's remarkable, but private practice is one thing that does not feature in there, or in industry for that matter.
I had 3 years with a law firm. I was with the law firm that became known as Bryan Cave and is now a longer name. This was right out of the FTC the first time. Right. My timesheets would say that it was more like 6 years than 3 years, but it was 3 calendar years with the law firm. Those were enormously important, perhaps disproportionately important compared to the actual amount of time I was there. I got to spend a great deal of time working for 2 clients in particular, with a company then known as McDonnell Douglas and a company known as Brown Shoe. With McDonnell Douglas, I spent a great deal of time inside their industrial facilities, working with engineers, working with business people, designing military weapon systems. Not a day goes by when I don't draw upon that. Everything I learned about supply chains, everything I learned about building new aircraft designs and carrying out innovative programs, especially in the face of enormous uncertainty, and just talking to business people about what they did and how they did it. That's been enormously informative to me, especially because at a time we're talking so much about innovation. Certainly at the time there was no more innovative sector, no sector that depended more on qualitative improvements in performance as a key objective than the aerospace sector. Second is I worked for Brown Shoe. One of the main project was to obtain the rescinding of an FTC order based on a 1966 Supreme Court decision involving exclusive dealing. That gave me the chance to walk through the modern history for Brown Shoe of its encounters with the antitrust laws, basically from the late 1950s up through the mid 80s when I worked for them at Bryan Cave. It was a way to see how arguably a misconception of competition law diminished the company's ability to respond to a fast-changing global environment. The Brown Shoe merger that was condemned in 1962 had a post-acquisition market share of a little over 5%. The vertical foreclosure was 1.2%. The Supreme Court said that was enough. And the vertical foreclosure in the exclusive dealing case involved about 800 retailing outlets out of a total of about 80,000. These were terminable at will by either party. In each instance, the firm was doing something to adapt to an environment which would feature expanded imports from overseas, both with respect to inexpensive footwear, but for more elegant footwear for men and women and for children's shoes as well. I often wonder from that experience whether the effect of a severe tightening of antitrust oversight on mergers, on distribution practices, severely diminished the ability of the United States and its footwear industry to adapt.
So let me ask, go ahead.
Yep.
So the broader question, I think, is why not private practice as a focal point for your career trajectory? Why government?
I found having the academic base in the first instance to be the best professional experience because it gave you so much flexibility and an opportunity to do research as well as teach. Government over private practice because you could set the agenda. Private practice involves, of course, a large number of individuals who've been enormously influential in discussions about what antitrust systems should do and how to do it. In your day-to-day routine, though, you are a servant to the matters that are coming in the door or the matters that you're chasing after. But you have less ability to say, this is the direction we should be traveling in. Now, I'll never suggest that the government service gives you that unbounded flexibility to decide where the ship will go. You get pushed by political currents. You get pushed by economic shocks. You can show up at work with a list of the 10 things you're going to do, and by 9 o'clock in the morning, the list is irrelevant because you're going to do something else. So I exaggerate to some degree the agenda setting possibilities that come in public service. But there was a more direct opportunity to influence the direction of policy for a single agency, your own, but also to have some influence in the development of principles, norms, concepts across borders as well. And in a public agency, you have access to those institutions. You participate directly in that process. In private practice, you don't. The OECD is an example where they have a committee, the Business Industry Advisory Committee, but they have a little place in a big room with a name card. There are points in the meetings where they're asked to leave. They have a voice, but I would say not. I'd say a secondary voice rather than a primary voice. The primary voice comes from the government decision makers. That's a long way of saying if you want to shape the enforcement program and shape the larger environment, the best place to do it is inside a public institution.
So that leads to the second question. And what leadership lessons did you glean from your time on the Hill?
The people I admired and worked for the most could never be elected today. So this is not a representative sample. I don't think Philip Hart could survive a primary in his party, nor could Charles Mathias, whom I worked for a summer, survive a primary in his party. They were both members of the Senate. Their traits that I admired, they were contemplative. They didn't come to snap decisions. And when faced with hard issues, they would say, I have to think about that some more without apology. Or they would acknowledge uncertainty or ambiguity in a number of circumstances before talking very loudly about what should be done. I found that gave the people they worked with great confidence that when they did reach decisions, and they knew how to do that the decisions were well-reasoned. As leaders, they were always committed to listening to witnesses and to gathering information. You saw it most clearly in the hearings that Hart ran in his subcommittee. They had countless days of hearings on a wide variety of economic policy and competition law topics, sector by sector. In many instances, Hart and a member of the minority and a few members of the staff would sit alone in a hearing room listening to a table with witnesses, without a gallery of dozens, listening, asking questions, learning in the process. If you watch a hearing today, the witness gets to spit out maybe a sentence before they're confronted with a legislator who's jabbing the fist and saying, answer my question, yes or no. The the witness doesn't get a chance to talk. Hart would let them talk and would
How
engage
much
in.
of that is a function of the way that media has crept into that process?
Unmistakably. One reason that I think we have a different type of legislator is that in this time, there was not the ubiquitous observation that exists now. It meant that there was not someone following you around, for example. Let's see if I have my prop here with me. I do. Following you around when you went to a meal or just walking down the street with one of these, click, 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 watching you all the time. There was not quite the urgency at every turn for an immediate snap answer to every development. I remember watching Hart at a press conference with what we would call the more traditional press now. He was asked about a question involving agricultural policy, and he stood before the camera and said, "I don't know. That's an issue I'd have to think about more. I just don't know." Today, to say, "I don't know," would produce a headline that says, Hart confesses ignorance. Why are we sending someone to Washington who doesn't know? The ubiquitous observation, the compression of information in the digital space that means to be heard on social networks and others. You have to take 1,000-word idea and compress it into 10. I think diminishes the quality of discourse, and that's a world they live in. And I so often feel disappointed for the way in which they live, the way in which they operate, what they say, but it's understandable in a way given what they go through. It led me to wonder why why a clear-minded individual would seek public office. That is, it's so hard. And we haven't talked about the begging for money that you have to do in order to be able to play in the game. But as a leadership technique, I greatly admired the commitment of Hart in particular to learn and to build as large a body of knowledge as he could to do his job well.
So is your prognosis for where things are headed like the Titanic? Large luxury liner, that's the United States, and we are on our way down.
There's certainly no guarantee that you keep sailing. There's no guarantee that your ships come through the journey unscathed. And there are hazards that if you're not careful in how you build them and operate them, that you can sink them. That's all present. You can. It is not written in any sacred text that you will go on forever. That is to be determined every year, every day, by the efforts of your nation.
Well, leads to the third question, which is the question of nations. And you have been probably to more nations than just about any trust or academic, Antitrust official academic in this country. What drives you to want to be part of, not just intellectually curious about what's going on, but be part of the establishment of antitrust regimes all around the world?
If you look at successful institutions in any field of endeavor, I think you find that one thing they do is they progress by learning. I'm convinced there's an enormous amount of learning about how to design institutions to make them effective, how to manage them to make them effective, what leaders should do to make them effective. And I'm convinced that if agencies take that on, if individual leaders take that on, they'll produce better policy. They'll produce better policy because their work is transparent and subject to challenge. They'll produce better policy because they're doing the right work and setting a foundation for policymaking and going about choosing new matters in a sensible way. They'll make better policy because they have a commitment to review the effects of what they've done in the past. So I'm convinced that there may not be, in a sense, one size fits all. How many times have you heard a speaker at a conference say this one size doesn't fit all? I understand the tailoring metaphor. I do not go into a clothing store and just pull a suit off the rack and walk out. I like to have it measured and fitted. But I do know that there are certain characteristics in a suit that you want, such as 2 arms, that is trousers with two legs. There are must-have items that are the essence of having a good suit of clothes. I think back to my aviation experience in McDonnell Douglas. There are lots of ways to design a wing on an airplane, many ways. How it's curved, how it's shaped, is it canted, is it at right angles with the fuselage? Many ways. What's a certainty is you want a wing on each side. A wing on each side of symmetrical shape and capability. Design it the way you like, but you need at least two of them. If you have one, you have a crash. So there are some concepts that I think are universal. Even though there are variations, there are universal concepts that are important, and that's what I would like agencies to think about.
Yeah. Let me ask you and unpack that analogy a little bit more with aircrafts and with clothes. There's a certain law of physics or law of biology that's at play here, and regardless of whatever your viewpoint on those might be, it's going to have those characteristics in order to function. When you have antitrust law or consumer protection, if you like, there's a lot of ideology which is not quite as black and white. And in fact, many will say it's driven by history, geography, and culture. So
Yes.
when you're trying to transpose the United States experience or European experience or what have you to another jurisdiction, do you get pushback and say, well, if this is just Western imperialism, this is not going to work here. It has to work for our culture. And those things that you consider to be wings or arms or legs, holes don't work because we don't consider those to be essential.
If you do approach your advice in the way that you've just suggested, you'll have no influence, and you will not be heard for just the reason you mentioned. I think the effective approach is to say, tell me what you want to do. I'm not going to tell you. I'm like the restaurant. I can tell me what kind of food you like. Tell me what you want to do here. Then I'll show you the menu. I'm not even going to tell you what to order off the menu. This is the menu of choices. If you want to ask me what I think is good on the menu, I'll tell you. But I'm not going to tell you what you should want. I'm not going to tell you. I'm going to let you read the menu. If you ask about, well, what have other people done? I can give you an idea, not just from the West. If you want to hear all the mistakes the West has made, I can tell you that too. But I can tell you from this larger panorama of agencies, I can give you some idea of what you're going to go through to undertake this program. If we shift from airplanes and clothing and food and menus to automobiles, I can tell you how these different automobiles perform. I can tell you what the owners of this model have experienced, how often it ends up in the shop, fuel consumption, comfort. I can tell you the experience they've had over time. I can tell you whether they buy a second after the first is worn out. I can give you a base of experience into which to situate your own choices. But I'm not going to, I will not tell you what to do or not to do. But if it comes to two wings or one, I will be somewhat more confident of telling you if you want to build a plane with two wings, that's a plane that has a greater chance of success. And I can support that by pointing to experiences. In fact, don't listen to me. I'll point you to the people you ought to talk to, because the people you really want to speak to are not the Western hegemonists and imperialists. You can listen to them, but the people you really want to talk to are people like you, people who've been in your rough circumstance, not identical, but similar demography, similar economy, similar political background, similar history. Talk to them and ask them how they like the experience, what works and doesn't work.
Do you see that happen in practice? Is that what the ICN is about?
I think it is happening more. I think one thing that the ICN helped inspire was greater regional and local networking.
Which, by the way, you were one of the architects of the ICN, right?
I was certainly a spectator at the creation, and had a voice. in thinking about what it might do, what its agenda might be. But I think one valuable spinoff from that experience is that many countries going to the big organizations, the large meetings, whether it was the OECD, whether it was the United Nations programs in Geneva, the UNCTAD, International Annual Meeting of Experts, whether it was ICN, you looked at the whole room and you realized, what do I have in common with all of these people? And the answer might be, aside from your basic humanity, maybe not much, your interest in competition law. But what do I have in common with people in the region? More. What do I have in common with agencies that are 5 years old or less, like mine? Maybe a lot. That has led in the direction of building regional and local networks, whether it's the African Competition Network, whether it's the Arab Competition Network, whether it's the outgrowth of ASEAN's competition policy program to serve as a unifying force in Asia, whether it is the Andean community in Latin America, whether it is the collection of academic networks that have been formed by a variety of universities in Latin America. All of these reflect efforts to find similarly situated countries and to say, instead of learning in isolation, what can we learn from these folks who've done this? That's happening. If I had to identify a single, maybe one of the single most important consequences of ICN, that's it. Regional, localized networks.
So how much mentoring happens?
I would say it varies a lot. The mentoring that matters most is ongoing and long-term. Because
how much mentoring happens? Oh, go ahead. Why don't you finish that thought?
Yeah, to be an effective advisor, you need to understand the local circumstances at a high level of sophistication, and you have to build trust with your counterparts, so they believe you are serving them and not simply your own narrow interests of somehow defined. That takes a lot of time. It requires effort to build the relationships. Not that many advisory groups or countries have the patience to do that.
And at a personal level, who would you consider to be your most influential mentors, and who are you mentoring, or who have you mentored?
The people who helped me enormously, one is Harlan Blake, who was on the faculty at Columbia, who very generously introduced me to Philip Hart's subcommittee staff that led to my time on the subcommittee. Harvey Goldschmidt, who was a member of the Columbia faculty at the same time, who was exceedingly generous in guiding me to think about the Federal Trade Commission, the Department of Justice, as possible career paths. And was a superb advisor on individual research projects. Both of them, my models for what an academic does on a good day. Harvey was an especially good classroom instructor too. So when I think of teaching, when I think about how to do the job, I try to channel Harvey Goldschmidt.
Did they inspire you to go into academia?
Yes. It was the inspiration that came from sitting in the room and watching day in and day out what I thought was a masterpiece, where it was clear that he had thought very carefully about the material, how to present it. I know now on this side of the profession how good he was and how careful he was. I've come to realize that nothing he was doing in any sense was natural or easy. Everything he did required a lot of effort behind the scenes that you never saw. All the practice, all the work that led to the performance on the stage. So I know now that he was even better than I thought he was at the time. And that I can remember days in class in my second year of law school looking at him saying, I want to be like that.
And mentoring from your point of view, what does mentoring look like in giving mentoring?
I'd say a couple of things. One is to provide a sense of the experiences that you want to put yourself in a position to have good choices in your career that There are things you can do to increase the range of things you want to do, especially if you're interested in public policy. If you want to teach, here are things you can do that in many ways, in the first 20 years of your working life, you're still learning. You're an apprentice. You're still gathering knowledge. You're building a base of understanding. You're working in different roles. I tell people it's a wonderful experience to spend time inside a public institution. Go to private practice for a while if you can. Extremely useful to see things from that side of the process. And that by the time, say, you're 40, you might well have 4 or 5 different jobs. But that in some ways, the sweet spot in your career is 40 and up, because that's when you've learned enough to do other things. I got to be the general counsel at the FTC when I was, oh goodness, let's see if I can count correctly. I was just about 50. I was 49. I could not have done that job at 39. Well, not done it well. I'll put aside how well I did it while I was there, but I could not have felt somewhat confident that I could do the tasks when I was 39. By 49, I'd learned a lot more. So if you want to have options to play a larger role, here are the kinds of experiences that you want to collect. In academic terms, these are the courses you want to take before you get to that role. And I also like to pass along my own thoughts about when you get to have a leadership role, what should you be like? Good institutions are built not by trashing everything that happened before, but by building on good things. Another person who molded me very much was Ernie Gellhorn, who was the dean of 3 law schools, who taught me a great deal. Ernie, before I started teaching, said, among the things you do, you praise lavishly and openly, you criticize privately and quietly. To the person you're talking about. You always do your best to be prepared. You don't have to be omniscient. Don't bluff. They'll understand. And that your aim every day is to do a Goldschmidt do. Go paint a masterpiece in the classroom. Do something like that every day. So I try to pass along to students and young colleagues everything I learned from these guys about how to do the job well.
So when you think about your legacy, and I know that you're at least a good decade away from slowing down, but it's perhaps not too early to think about how to use those next 10 years to solidify, crystallize, and institutionalize some of those things that you really care about. What does that look like to you?
It partly looks like trying to continue to distill what I've learned from the process of implementation, to write more about project selection, priority setting, to take what I've learned in observing officials in a variety of different settings and trying to convey the know-how that doesn't show up in books, but to try to put it in books, to teach that in seminars, workshops for people who are in positions of new responsibility, to focus attention on improving techniques for measuring consequences, evaluation. How do we know it works? It's hard to evaluate, but it's not a good answer to throw up your hands and say, trust me, it's a good idea, but to focus more on evaluation. So I guess on the value of historical awareness for an agency, of knowing where it's been, where it might be going, and conscious steps it can take to learn from that experience to be better the next time.
Thanks. Final question. We'll end on a note of hope. It's a question about hope. You can talk about that from a personal level, institutional level, antitrust level. Take it at whatever direction you want.
I derive a lot of hope from a couple of experiences. I was invigorated by the way I saw the Competition and Markets Authority build a new institution from 2 predecessors, and how they went about doing their work. The continuing theme isn't, my God, we inherited a collapsed organization. It was, this is a great organization. We're going to do even better. The way that they took to build analytical capability to improve their ability to do good work, the investment in knowledge and capability. I find that very hopeful. I find it extremely hopeful to see, in many instances, the younger generation of lawyers and economists who've gone into the field, people with exceptional capabilities that I see in practice, but also see in agencies. And last, the best source of hope is in the classroom. I'm knocked over day in and day out at how good our students are, how their intellectual gifts, their propensity for hard work, their good personal sensibilities, the broader social awareness. Many of them, I collect their resumes, and you can see that they're doing things that have an outward-looking social dimension to them that's very admirable and is not just resume grooming. So when I look at the formidable list of difficulties they will have to cope with, gives me a lot of confidence that they'll be able to do it successfully. That is the best reason to be in the class and teach, is to be in the classroom and see the face of a better future.
A great and wonderful note of hope to end on. Thank you, Professor Bill Kovacic, and thank you for all that you have done in your remarkable, remarkable career. We look forward to the next 10 years.
Thank you, Professor Lean. I look forward to the next 10, not even halfway to 200 yet, so we'll work on it.
Yeah. Thank you.